Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Kailey Leinz alongside Mathieu here on Bloomberg TV and radio on this Friday, Jobs Friday at that. And what a coincidence that the Jobs Day actually coincides with pretty lengthy remarks from the Fed chair, Jay Powell, before the Fed enters its blackout period. Its March meeting, of course, week after next. The Fed is not expected to do anything at that meeting, and the chairman basically confirmed it as he suggested. Once again, there's no hurry to make further policy adjustments. And it was interesting to hear from the chairman, Joe, this notion that the path to returning to their inflation target has been bumpy. He expects that to continue, and perhaps further bumpiness assessment is required when you're considering whether or not there is going to be tariffs that would have an inflationary impact. As we heard President Trump in the Oval Office just in the last hour, after giving some reprieve to Canada just yesterday, saying reciprocal tariffs on Canadian lumber and dairy could go into effect as soon as today.
Today, or not.
Or not.
Which seems to be the problem. Although watching the markets lift off their lows, I guess, was encouraging after the NASDAQ fell into correction territory earlier today. Michael McKee is actually there. He was in the room for Jay Powell's remarks and joins us from the U.S. Monetary Policy Forum. This is sponsored again by the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Michael, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on. As Kailey mentioned, the big takeaways here, the big headlines, the Fed doesn't need to hurry. Could wait for greater clarity. The path to 2%, Michael, going to be bumpy. So nothing's new, is it?
No, there's really not a whole lot new here. I think maybe what fed the market reaction, the brief recovery that you had in the markets, was just the sense of calm that the chairman exhibited, the idea that the Fed doesn't have to do anything right away because the economy's in good shape. He talked about how the labor market was in good shape. Inflation is coming down, still too high, as you mentioned. It could be bumpy, but he wasn't giving a lot of warning signals that there is something wrong at this point that the Fed would have to react to. Now, obviously, he said tariffs could be inflationary. They're anticipating that prices will go up. But because we have no idea exactly what the president is going to do, the Fed at this moment has no idea what it's going to do. And that's kind of where everybody else on the Fed is at the moment.
Well, and is it the Fed's biggest potential problem right now, Mike, is that the consumer has no idea where things are going either, and we're starting to see consumer inflation expectations pick up. He did call that out today, although he noted it's not necessarily in longer-term expectations, and that's really what they care most about.
Well, we did see the University of Michigan's 5-year inflation expectations move up in the last month. We'll get another report from Michigan next week, and we'll see where they are. Also, the New York Fed does its own survey of expectations, comes out next week. So we'll have a better idea. Of course, the Fed won't be talking at that point. But they are worried that if we see a continual series of tariffs, as the president sort of continues to threaten, that might drive consumer expectations higher. And we did see expectations rise, both on the short end significantly and the longer end a little bit, just on the headlines that you were getting from the president on tariffs after he came into office. So people are very sensitive to that, and Jay Powell made the point that this is not the pre-COVID era. People are used to inflation now, and so they're perhaps more sensitive to the fact that it could jump up again.
And by considering the Fed's dual mandate, some of the concerns surrounding the job market, not in this report so much today, but concerns that thousands of fired federal workers could really change the trajectory of growth in the labor market. How would that change the Fed's view when it comes to interest rates?
Well, it would be an interesting question because it would depend on how serious it is. Federal workers, all of them, about 2 million of them, make up about 1.5% of the total labor force. So if several 100,000 lose their job, it isn't going to make a big difference. It could bleed over into other sectors, though, as people whose jobs are built around these federal government workers, restaurants or stores or things like that, if people lose their jobs, we could see an expansion. And obviously the contractors, the civilian contractors who do work for the federal government could lose their jobs. Now, if that starts to spread, then you get perhaps a psychological effect on the rest of consumers who start to worry about their jobs, and then they pull back on spending. And that's the classic way a recession starts.
Well, and wouldn't that suggest, Mike, that while everybody's, to Joe's point on the dual mandate, trying to focus on the inflationary side, and that's preliminary or primarily what the Fed has been keying off of too, that actually the growth risks might be greater or just as great as the inflation risks right now, as we are seeing that consumer pullback potentially that you're talking about, that could be further fueled.
Well, the problem for the Fed is they're caught in the middle here, and they're very happy with the fact that right now inflation's coming down slowly, but coming down, and the labor market is solid. The problem is, if the labor market deteriorates a lot, that's a suggestion that we're going to see growth fall off, and then you start to worry about recession, and then you start thinking about cutting interest rates. If inflation rises, then they would have to start thinking about raising interest rates, which would also probably lead you into recession. So they'd be caught between a rock and a hard place. So they don't have a lot of good policy choices if this all goes pear-shaped. And there is a genuine consensus, I think, at the Fed and among people on Wall Street that President Trump has a very, very narrow path to make this work.
We're looking at a rising stock market at this point. Mike, the S&P is up 10 points. We were sharply lower earlier. The NASDAQ in correction territory this morning, now up 18 points. I realize it isn't rally time, but the turnaround was significant. You credited that to the calm that Jay Powell spoke to the markets. He's got to be quiet for a little while now. How damaging could that be for a nervous Wall Street?
Well, it depends on the psychology of markets, which I can't claim to know at this point. If there was a feeling and an ongoing feeling that a sell-off was due, which I think there was, and you're looking for reasons to sell, then you have to ask, where are we in that cycle? Next week we get the inflation numbers from the CPI, and then we'll get those Michigan numbers. Will those contribute to a negative feeling that's enough to keep markets going down, or have we gotten back to a little bit more of proper valuation, and people will either hold and wait and see what happens with the tariffs or start to go back up again?
All right, Bloomberg's Michael McKee live on the scene where we just heard from Chairman Powell. Thank you so much. As we consider what Mike was just talking about, tariffs, this is actually something that our colleague, Jonathan Farrow, had the chance to speak with the National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett about earlier this morning, as once again, we're getting new headlines from President Trump around tariffs he may or may not impose on partners like Canada. This is how Director Hassett spoke about it.
I think in some sense that you've got quite a bit of clarity already. There's no uncertainty. There's going to be some tariff. It's going to be reciprocal. If you don't like tariffs very much, then reciprocal could be a great thing for you, because then countries around the world will be lowering their tariffs. But the president believes that if we replace income tax revenue with tariff revenue, it can make everybody better off.
Make everybody better off. Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, not all economists are privy to that same view.
No, and it brings us back to this idea of short-term pain, this adjustment that the market may, or the economy itself may or may not be going through here, what this could mean longer term for tariffs with China. Markets don't have a lot of tolerance for that kind of talk right now, although I guess we are seeing a better vibe in stocks since Jay Powell spoke. But this idea of a short-term correction has yet to be quantified.
Well, yeah, certainly. And we talk about better vibes today. Better vibe just means we're roughly even on the major benchmarks after they have fallen to below the levels where they were on Election Day, after we found out that it was President Trump who was the victor in that. The NASDAQ 100 earlier today, as you mentioned, Joe, fell into correction territory, though it's not clear whether or not we're going to end the trading the day there. So obviously the stock market is not the economy, but the economy is feeding into what we're seeing in the stock market. And on this jobs day, we want to reflect more on just how healthy the economy is and turn to Kitty Richards. She's senior strategic advisor and senior fellow at the Groundwork Collaborative. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Kitty. If we could just begin with the data we do have in hand today, a jobs report that showed a little bit higher unemployment of 4.1%. 3%, but stronger than expected manufacturing payrolls specifically. What read does it provide you on the labor market right now, knowing that everything that's happening with cuts in the federal government is not yet reflected in these figures?
Thank you, Kailey. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that the chaos that the Trump administration is sowing in the markets and among consumers has not yet had a chance to really filter through to the broad economic indicators, things like the BLS Jobs Day. And the cuts that are being made to the federal government workforce are really going to start to hit home, not just in the labor market, where we're going to see laid off workers trying to find new jobs, unable to make rent payments, mortgage payments. This could cause real problems in local economies across the country because federal workers are not just in the DC area, but also the services that those government workers are providing are going to start degrading rapidly. And, we're hearing that the Trump administration is looking for a short-term correction for long-term benefits, but it's really clear who's going to benefit from these policies, if anyone, and that's Elon Musk and the other billionaires that are currently running the government. Workers are going to see the CFPB has been gutted, and they're going to see financial institutions taking advantage of them and their families with no watchdog to stop it. They're going to struggle with the Social Security Administration, where the Trump administration ousted the head of SSA so that they could get their hands on sensitive data, and are now threatening deeper cuts to services while also lying about non-existent fraud in the State of the Union. All of these things are going to start to show up in the labor market, and they're already showing up in the lives of workers and families.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know to what extent there was lying about fraud, but we were just talking to Michael McKee about the impact of federal worker layoffs. As you talk about this yourself, Kitty, could we be in a world in which this effort by the Trump administration and the ancillary impact that you're describing is what prompts the Federal Reserve to start cutting rates again?
I think that the Fed is in a really difficult position because the Trump administration is simultaneously engaging in these federal worker cuts that absolutely could ripple through the economy and cause contraction, while also sowing chaos in the markets and threatening things that might drive up inflation. And so it's a really difficult situation. I will say that I believe that the Fed should have cut interest rates more quickly than they did. And we are still seeing persistent inflation problems in the housing sector. But that's not going to be aided by the Fed holding mortgage interest rates and other interest rates higher. Those interest rates are really harming American families as they go out into the world and try to purchase homes, try to pay their rent, try to make ends meet in the current environment. But it is really difficult to do monetary policy when there's this much chaos.
Well, to your point on mortgage rates, we have seen them come down as we've seen bond yields falling specifically. And this administration has contended, Kitty, that they don't necessarily need the Fed to be cutting interest rates, that there are mechanisms through which they can actually bring rates down on their own and still have that relief provided to wannabe home buyers or people who need to borrow money that you're alluding to. Are there actual fiscal means with which they can do that in your mind?
I mean, the government has a lot of power to make homes more affordable, but I don't think anything the Trump administration is planning gets at that core issue for the American people. There are lots of things that the government can do to bring down the prices of healthcare and groceries and the things that Americans rely on. And the Trump administration is moving in the opposite direction. So I wouldn't take those promises at face value.
We had a conversation with Larry Summers just this week, getting back to this idea of short-term pain for long-term gain, I think, as you described it. Kitty, Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, says that's the new transitory. It sounds like you agree.
If we're talking about the Trump administration's promises that somehow this chaotic approach to managing the economy and allowing the wealthiest man on earth to loot the federal government is going to somehow eventually trickle down to workers. I think that is preposterous, and we're not seeing any evidence of that. I don't think that we can take these claims at face value at this point. And so I agree that it would be silly to take the Trump administration's claims about their policies and evaluate them without reference to all of the other wild claims that they have made. And none of it is playing out in the data. We know what is going to happen when you have a government that is cutting sweetheart deals with Tesla, rampaging through the federal workforce, cutting services to people, all in the service of tax cuts for the very wealthiest and corporations, which is what the Republicans in Congress are currently working toward. We have 50 years of evidence that kind of behavior harms American workers in the short, medium, and long term.
Well, if you just consider then the administration's objectives, if you don't agree with their policy that they've suggested as a means of getting there, Kitty, if the objective is to juice American growth, to incentivize American manufacturing, what is the proper way to go about that if it isn't raising tariffs on trading partners and cutting taxes as they have outlined?
I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act investments in manufacturing and reshoring are beginning to bear fruit now, and this administration is trying to roll all of those back. I think the way that we invest in American manufacturing, American workers, is by investing in American manufacturing and American workers, not by capriciously threatening our closest trading partners with tariffs that do nothing but roil the markets, while also, by the way, behind the scenes, walking back things like promises to close loopholes that allow China to ship goods into the United States without inspection. This policy is just really incoherent, and so it's difficult to evaluate it on the merits. But I do think that we have ample evidence that an investment-led strategy can be really helpful. And we saw business investment, private investment, go up near the end of the Biden administration. And that was the fruits of the investments that the administration made over the course of the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic.
Kitty, it's great to have you back. Kitty Richards, Senior Strategic Advisor, Senior Fellow at the Groundwork Collaborative. In the wake of Jay Powell's comments and on this jobs day, we are tepidly higher on Wall Street after a very negative start to trading here, Kailey. The S&P 500 up 6 points. NASDAQ is up 8 after touching correction territory. The Dow's up over 100 points. Big jump in McDonald's today, which might speak to this whole theme that we're touching on.
Yeah, and this theme obviously doesn't just apply to equity markets. We're looking at the bond market as well. Interestingly, while yields were lower in the aftermath of today's jobs data, once we heard from Chairman Powell, they ticked up a bit. We're up 2 basis points on the 10-year, 2 basis points on the 2-year as well. Those yields 4.29 and 3.97% respectively. And Bitcoin, 88,000 as the White House Crypto Summit kicks off today.
You wouldn't think that was happening based on the price action, but there's some concern about using seized coins, not buying new ones. We'll talk about that coming up next right here on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Meantime, in Washington, we're particularly interested in the price action in Bitcoin today, because if I were to tell you, it would actually be down the day after a long-awaited executive order to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve from President Trump was signed, you might not necessarily believe it. Of course, he talked about this on the campaign trail. He said he would do it. It just finally came. Part of the whole promises made, promises kept thing, I guess, Joe. But those who invest in crypto specifically may have been hoping that this promise was going to be kept a little bit differently, as in this would mean the government was going to start buying Bitcoin rather than just taking what the government had already seized and putting it into this reserve. answer.
That was the dream, which I guess could still be realized, but they're going to start this way. Scott Bessent was talking about this earlier today in an interview, suggesting that at least they're going to stop selling Bitcoin, create the reserve, and then maybe move on from there. But there's been a lot of disappointment around this lately. The post on Truth Social a couple days ago that suggested investing in a series of different tokens sent Bitcoin lower. And now here we are again today, although it's coming off its lows of the session.
Yeah, and I would point out that David Sachs, the White House crypto and AI czar, did join Bloomberg earlier today and talked a little bit about this. This is what he said.
The reason why we need a Bitcoin reserve is that the federal government already owns some. In fact, it obtained around 400,000 Bitcoin over the past decade through criminal and civil forfeitures and seizures. And so the government has to have a strategy for how it deals with this.
Our conversation with Kristen Smith, the Blockchain Association CEO, is with us at the table as the crypto summit gets underway down the street at the White House. Kristen, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio.
Great to be here.
What do you make of this frustration? Do you share it? Were you hoping that the White House was going to start buying
No,
Bitcoin?
I think what happened last night with the executive order that created a Bitcoin strategic reserve and a digital asset stockpile, I think it hit the nail on the head. This is exactly the type of signal that we need to show that the United States is serious about keeping the capital, or making the U.S. the crypto capital of the world, but doesn't go so far that we have the U.S. government going out there into the market and buying digital assets. I think, as the AI and crypto czar David Sachs pointed out earlier on Bloomberg today, that the U.S. already has a lot of these assets. We need to take an inventory, put it in one place. But I do think that there were some around the world that don't fully understand the limits of executive power. I think if you want to have the government going out and spending money to buy crypto, that is something that Congress needs to do, and that is not within the scope of the executive order. So I think there's maybe just a misunderstanding of the powers that are out there. But, I'm excited to see this established because I think we're really ready to move the conversation on to what can we do to establish a regulatory framework that keeps the U.S. competitive for generations to come. And a lot of that work right now is happening on Capitol Hill with negotiations around stablecoin bill, market structure, and some of these other issues. And so I'm excited to see this issue hopefully put to the side for now so we can focus on the really difficult work of finding the right regulatory framework.
Well, to your point, Kristen, on Congress having to play a role here, we did get a statement from the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, French Hill, today, which in part read, "I encourage the administration to collaborate with Congress, particularly in regard to the structure and any funding related to the strategic Bitcoin reserve." Are all parties aligned on not just this, but the other things you were talking about, the way in which to pursue a strategy around market structure and stable coins? Is David Sachs going to be singing the same tune as Chairman Hill or Chairman Scott, for that matter?
Yeah, I think everybody's aligned with the goal, and there are a lot of different ways, I think, to get to the same goal. And I think a healthy policymaking process is the one we're having now, where we allow different ideas to be vetted, debated, suggested, and to allow this collaboration. But I think the fact that we have the White House that is convening industry to hear from them, they've invited representatives from Capitol Hill to join. We've had David Sachs go to the Hill and be part of press conferences there. I think the type of collaboration going on between the agencies, between the White House and between Congress is very important to making sure that all of the considerations are in place. I think what we saw over the last 4 years is we weren't having that kind of dialogue. We were instead just seeing enforcement actions, a lot of litigation, and that wasn't the right approach. This open dialogue, discussion, and debate is exactly what we need, and I'm really confident that we can build on the legislative work that Congress did last year and get these items in place as we move further along into the year.
So clearly you see this as a legitimizing action
Absolutely.
today, this executive
Absolutely.
order. When you look at the language, though, that David Sachs has been using, any acquisitions would require budget-neutral strategies.
Yeah.
This is Washington. How long do you need to wait for that?
Yeah, well, listen, I think that there's going to be a brainstorm as to how potentially we could add more Bitcoin. One idea I have, I do think this would also require an act of Congress, is let people pay their taxes in Bitcoin, or let's collect all these tariffs in Bitcoin. I think there's a lot of way that we can bring Bitcoin.
Is China paying in Bitcoin? That would be something.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's ideas out there, and I think, the key is that the White House doesn't have the authority to spend taxpayer dollars that Congress hasn't given them. And so this is, I think, a really smart way. I think they've thread the needle, and I think it sends a strong statement. I think there may be some disappointment in the markets today, but I think as we move forward, this is a really stable policy and not something that would just be undone with another, stroke of the pen in a future administration.
So to Joe's point on it lending legitimacy to the industry, is that also what today's summit is about, or are you expecting that there's going to be tangible outcomes from all of these executives meeting at the White House?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is an absolutely historic day. I think 16 years ago, when Satoshi, issued the white paper and then, Bitcoin was running, I don't think anyone could have imagined something like this happening at the White House. I mean, this is absolutely historic. I think it really sends a strong signal that crypto is valued here in the U.S. This is an important industry and that we want to lead. And I do think we could see some further announcements today. I mean, I think that we are looking at things in sort of two steps. The first step is we need to undo the damage of the last administration. The second step is we need to put the regulatory and framework in place that allows the U.S. to be competitive for generations. And so I do think we can see a lot of discussion today about, what are the outstanding remaining items that we need to change from the last administration. There's a lot of guidance out there. There's a lot of proposed rulemakings that could be very damaging. We need to wipe that away so we can roll up our sleeves and do the real work to get the regulatory framework in place.
How big is the tent with the Blockchain Association
when
it comes to meme coins? This White House has cranked a few out, and there's an argument about whether this actually helps or hurts the industry.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think meme coins are, a perfectly legitimate and wonderful technology, right? People are allowed to enjoy novelties. They're allowed to have fun, and that's what meme coins do. I think, there is a little bit of anxiety when you have the president playing in this space. I don't think he's doing anything wrong. I think he's doing everything that is allowed under the law. There has been legislation that Congressman Liccardo introduced that would prevent elected officials from issuing their own meme coins, and I think that's an important debate for Congress to have. But I mean, listen, we went from a president who, his administration did everything within their power to try to stop this industry, to a president who is all in, who is very enthusiastic, and who's participating. And so, I will take the challenges of an overly enthusiastic president any day compared to having to deal with Gary Gensler in the last administration.
Well, and so that brings me back to your point about there's kind of two phases here. One, the unwinding of before, and then we get to the after. If the after has to include, to create a regulatory framework, market structure legislation emanating from Congress, which we got in the last one, didn't ultimately cross the finish line. I would imagine it's going to look pretty different now that Republicans have full control. What timeline are you expecting there? If there's still all this kind of backward-looking work that needs to be done, when does that forward progress happen?
Well, I think there's a lot of momentum building in Congress. We just this week, gosh, that was only this week.
They all run together.
I know. We had a Congressional Review Act resolution in the Senate that got 18 Democrats and 1 independent that joined. We have a same resolution voted on in the House next week. I think that is starting to build very bipartisan momentum. That undoes the work of the past. We're seeing work on stablecoin bills, new drafts introduced. We have markups and hearings next week. I think that will continue to build that momentum, and we could see that as early as this summer. And then I think it's very likely that we could get market structure done by the end of the year. I think that there are a lot of discussions going on. Especially between the House and the Senate. I have never seen so much collaboration at a staff level and on a member level between the House and the Senate. So I think they're serious about getting this done, and we're really excited at the Blockchain Association for the unique moment we find ourselves in, and we're ready to be a partner as policymakers are exploring ideas.
Dance card's pretty full on Capitol Hill right now as we
stare
down the pipe of a potential government shutdown, this massive reconciliation project. They're talking about Trump tax cuts and so forth. What can Donald Trump say today? He's going to speak, he's scheduled to an hour and a half from now at the Crypto Summit to hasten and put some urgency underneath this effort on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think highlighting it as a priority is really sends a signal to Congress that this is something he wants to get done. I'm hopeful that he will speak to a bipartisan audience, because whatever regulatory framework gets put in place, we want it to be lasting. We don't want it to be something that changes every time there's a change in power. And so I'm hoping that he will speak to a bipartisan audience. And I think that, with his leadership and with with the folks in the industry around the room being helpful in the process, like I think we can get there. And so this is in the U.S. interest. I don't think innovation is something that is more Republican or more Democrat. And so I'm hoping he shows some leadership and tries to bring people together. I think that stands in contrast to some of the other issues and debates going on. And so I think it's nice to have something where everyone can be on the same team.
Well, it was great to have you here on our team for at least
Yeah.
today. Thank you so much for joining us in studio.
Thanks for having me.
Kristen Smith, CEO of the Blockchain Association, with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. Of course, a lot of the members of the Blockchain Association are at the White House right now as we speak. The gathering was slated to begin around 1:30 today. A whole host of CEOs there at the White House to plead their case. You know who's not going to be there, though? Former CEO, used to be the emissary to Washington, Sam Bankman-Fried.
How about that?
He's still looking for a pardon from President Trump. I wonder if we
That's
hear
probably
anything
not coming
about
in the
that
speech
today. I wouldn't think
but
so.
that would be a headline, and we're used to that around here. We'll be listening, of course, when Donald Trump speaks. 3 p.m. Eastern, they tell us. We'll let you know right here on the fastest show in politics. With Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Don't we say that every Friday? What a week. Yeah, we're doing it again. And thank you for meeting us here at the threshold of the weekend. Jobs Day showing some signs of softening. More people permanently out of work. Payrolls came in a bit light, 151,000. The estimate was for 160. Unemployment, 4.1%. We heard earlier today from one of the president's closest economic advisors, Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, on Bloomberg Surveillance, speaking with John Farrow. Here's what he said.
We're preparing you for news like today, the great jobs report. I think one of the things that you see, if you look at it, is exactly the objectives of the Trump administration, and the fact that even though we got a lot of work to do, we got to pass the tax cuts and get this deregulation train rolling, is that we're going to be reducing government employment and reducing government spending and increasing manufacturing employment. And as you can see in the jobs report today, you're already seeing a pivot in that direction. That's a huge one. And so last year, 111,000 manufacturing jobs were destroyed by the Biden administration's policies. And in this month alone, in February, we got 10,000 manufacturing jobs and 9,000 auto jobs. And as you know, those auto jobs are, here, they're going to be paid well, and they're here for a good long time. And that's really just sort of a down payment on the Trump policies that are going to skyrocket into a golden age as soon as we get the tax cuts passed.
So, Kevin, I hope you're right, but what I've heard over the last week or so regarding the economic data, when I spoke to the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, Secretary Lutnick said that this was Biden data over the last month, that this was not Trump data. So if it's good, is it Trump data? And if it's bad, is it Biden data? How does this work?
Let's go into the specifics. So what specifically has happened is President Trump has made a big effort, along with Elon Musk, to find workers that are unproductive and to get them off the payrolls. And so we see government spending going down. So is that a Trump effect? Yes. Manufacturing and job creation in the auto sector is happening because people are anxious about future tariffs and they're already onshoring production. Is that a Trump effect? Yes. But it's true that we've inherited a lot of terrible Biden policies. They want to, get expensing gone and so on, and that's bad for capital formation. We're going to fix that. So we haven't fixed everything, but already the things that we're fixing, you can see in the data, and I think it's really quite remarkable.
Well, let's talk about the manufacturing data as well. We had that over the past few weeks. You're familiar with ISM manufacturing. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the respondents in the surveys, and this is what they had to say. The uncertainty about tariffs keeps us cautious on spending. Customers are pausing on new orders as a result of uncertainty regarding tariffs. The incoming tariffs are causing our products to increase in price. Are you hearing the same message from businesses? Are you hearing something different?
What I'm hearing is a massive amount of onshoring. We've got more than, $1.5 trillion in commitments for new factories, and you're already seeing it in the auto data. I mean, think about it, how hard it is to create a job in the auto sector, and to have 10,000 in a month means that the attempt to onshore activity, to make it so that the jobs are created here and the money isn't just, frittered away to foreign countries, is exactly what President Trump's objective is, and it's right there in the data. Now, I know that it's 1 month and the data can blip around, But I was really, really stunned. And the other thing I was stunned about, which I know you guys follow this a lot. In fact, Anna Wong at Bloomberg is one of the best young economists I know at looking at the numbers, is that it was a really bad flu season. And so when I adjusted for the flu, what I thought this number was going to be, it was way below the number that we got. And so I was very positively surprised by this number once you adjust for flu. And then you see that all these jobs that are created in manufacturing. And finally, if you go back and look at the Biden job record, mindful of the fact that they revised it down 1 million jobs last year, don't forget that a lot of the job creation was government workers. It was government workers. About a quarter of the job creation over the last 2 years was an increase in government workers. And so if you take those out and then still have a strong jobs number, that's a great economic outcome.
Kevin Hassett at the White House earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Watching Wall Street off the jobs news didn't start well, Kailey, but we have turned higher after the chair of the Fed spoke earlier. Jay Powell seemed to soothe the markets into changing course here, though Bitcoin is still lower on this crypto summit day.
Yeah, we're expecting to hear from President Trump at the crypto summit at 3 p.m. Eastern. At least that's when it's scheduled, though he's also scheduled to sign executive orders just half an hour before that at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we already actually heard from him in the Oval Office today as he spoke to reporters, suggesting one of those executive orders he will be signing will restrict eligibility for government-run student loan forgiveness for individuals who work for nonprofits that clash with the administration's immigration policies. This is not necessarily, though, the education-oriented executive order we thought we might be getting from the president this week, as there had been reporting that he could be signing an EO to dismantle the Department of Education. The White House has suggested, though, that at least on timing, that is fake news for now.
Yeah, that was the tweet or the X post, I guess, from the press secretary yesterday. Some folks do, again, to your point, though, think it's just a matter of when that happens. The president's been pretty clear about his intentions.
Yeah, including the new secretary, Linda McMahon, saying that her job basically is to get herself out of a job.
Turn the lights out.
Eventually. But we want to go to someone who used to hold that job now, who I'm pleased to say is joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, former Education Secretary Margaret Spellings during the Bush administration, who is now president and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for your time. If we could just begin with what has been a very clear effort on the part of Donald Trump to work toward getting rid of the Department of Education. We've already seen Linda McMahon, for example, offering buyouts to employees, some of which have been accepted. What would the immediate impact be, even if this is a slow unraveling, on education in America?
Well, and I'm glad this is a segment that comes right after a discussion of jobs and the jobs numbers, because we can't talk about jobs and good jobs without getting quickly to education and the quality of the American worker. And that's what we're focused on at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And, what I'm hearing is, yes, there's a discussion around how federal programs should be deployed, but not a question about many of those federal programs. Obviously, there's still strong support for the title programs on the K-12 side that support low income and special ed students. There's still support for financial aid for higher ed students, although we ought to be smarter about how we do that and connecting it to the needs of the workforce. But it's basically, how are we going to organize and oversee the federal role? And so are there efficiencies to be gained? Heck, yes. And I'm looking forward to working with Secretary McMahon and her team to talk about the best ways to do that. It has grown a good bit over time, the federal workforce, as has been said. And how are we smarter about how to do that?
We heard from Donald Trump on this, Secretary, and we've heard him speak a couple of times. I'd like to just go back, if we could, to the 4th of February. This is Donald Trump in the Oval Office when he was asked about his intentions here to basically eliminate the Department of Education. Linda McMahon had not yet been confirmed. Here's what that exchange sounded like.
I told Linda, I hope you do a great job and put yourself out of a job. I want her to put herself out of a job. We're ranked at the bottom of the list. We're ranked very badly. And what I want to do is let the states run schools. I believe strongly in school choice. But in addition to that, I want the states to run schools. And I want Linda to put herself out of a job.
Put herself out of a job, Margaret Spellings. Does that sound like somebody you can work with?
Well, states do run schools. Most of the money obviously comes from states and local school districts. I think Americans and President Trump obviously are rightly frustrated with the quality of education in America today. And so what we need to decide is, where is the role around accountability and transparency for achievement, for federal funding, for the investments we do make, and the outcomes that states and local school districts are getting. And we can certainly do a better job of doing that. There's been a lot of discussion around authority for governors to be more involved in some of those funding decisions about the use of federal aid. But sure, are there parts of the Department of Education that might go elsewhere, might be managed better elsewhere? Possibly. Does it make a lot of sense for school districts and universities to interface with a multitude of federal agencies or just one? I think she is an experienced businesswoman. She has experience in the federal government, and I think she's going to do, President Trump said yesterday, a good scalpel job on looking at what can be approved over there. We don't want to ship fat programs just around the federal government. We need to have them run efficiently wherever they end up. And obviously, the Congress is going to have the last word on much of this.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go next. We actually spoke with a Congressman, Ryan McKenzie, who sits on the Education Committee yesterday, who told us this has to go through Congress. This can't be up to the executive branch alone. Whether it is drastic changes potentially to the Department of Education or other agencies that we have seen the Department of Government Efficiency trying to pursue an end to, USAID, the CFPB, for example, do you see congressional appetite to actually partake in that activity, or would you anticipate, and I'm asking you to put that Bipartisan Policy Center hat on right now, that there might be some pushback?
Oh, I think there'll absolutely be pushback on this and everything else. That can describe anything. But yeah, absolutely. The Congress is going to have their say over this, and I think Secretary McMahon is eager to engage with them. That's certainly what she told them during her confirmation hearing, and do that in a smart way. My hope is that we have to keep the main thing. And the main thing that we are all concerned about is the quality of reading and math education in our country. We got the report card a few weeks ago, and it's shocking. It's something we all ought to be up in arms about. And so rather than talk about, the movement of the deck chairs as the dominant matter, we need to be talking about how we best teach children to read and do math, so that they're prepared to enter the workforce and be successful.
Secretary, you run the Bipartisan Policy Center, bipartisan being the key word in this political climate, this partisan climate that we're living in right now in Washington, D.C. Is this mission impossible?
No, it is not. And there's lots of bipartisan energy that's going on and will go on and must go on before deals are done at the end of the day. We, as you know, have very close margins in the House and the Senate. It'll take 60 votes to abolish the Department of Education. I don't necessarily see that happening. And so being smart about giving a plan about how to run the thing better. Nobody that I engage with is in support of waste, fraud, and abuse. Yeah, you bet. We're not going to extend the tax cuts. We're not going to raise the debt ceiling. We're not going to keep the government open, over time without bipartisan support for those things.
Well, it's not just a question of the government being open over time. It's a question of if the government's going to stay open beyond a week from today, when the deadline is for funding to come through Congress. Are you ultimately expecting that there will be bipartisanship in that effort? Because right now, Democrats are signaling, at least in the House, they are not willing at this time to participate in that effort.
And we may well have a shutdown. I certainly wouldn't want to make any wagers about that either way. What I'm saying is, over the long haul, these big policies of closing the Department of Education or extending the tax cuts will ultimately come down to bipartisan agreements.
Secretary, it's great to have you on. Margaret Spellings, President, CEO, Bipartisan Policy Center. We appreciate the conversation. Come back and talk to us again. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.